There is a day in every empire's life when it understands the future will not include it. Not the day it falls, not the day it announces its end, the day it realizes. And that day arrives quietly, without ceremony, without headlines. The empire still stands. The flags still fly. The maps show territories in red. But somewhere, in a room far from the public, someone understands. The illusion has been broken. The empire knows it cannot continue as it once did. And yet, the world outside still believes. Because empires do not announce their own deaths. They simply stop believing in their immortality. This is the story of that day for Britain. If you're drawn to quiet stories about power, ambition, and the moment's history doesn't announce out loud, like this video and subscribe to Echoes of Greatness. In 1945, Britain emerged from the Second World War on the winning side. Its empire covered a quarter of the Earth's land surface. Over 500 million people lived under the British Crown. From Hong Kong to Kenya, from India to the Caribbean, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The British Navy still patrolled the world's trade routes. The pound sterling remained the second reserve currency. British diplomats sat at every major negotiating table. The empire had defeated Hitler. It had survived the Blitz. It had endured when others fell. To the outside world, Britain was still a great power, one of the big three, a victor, a nation with global reach and global responsibility. The government spoke confidently about Britain's role in shaping the post-war world. Politicians promised continuity, stability, leadership. The public believed it. So did much of the world. But belief and reality had already begun to separate. And within a decade, Britain would face a moment that forced it to see the gap. The war had been won, but the cost was extraordinary. Britain had spent everything. By 1945, the national debt stood at 250% of GDP. The treasury was empty. Rationing continued long after the fighting stopped. Bread was rationed in 1946. Bread, which had never been rationed during the war itself. The nation that once financed half the world now depended on American loans to survive. In 1945, the United States provided a $3.75 billion loan. Without it, Britain would have faced economic collapse within months. The empire required constant expenditure. Garrisons, colonial administrations, naval bases, infrastructure. But Britain no longer had the resources to maintain them. India, the jewel of the empire, had become ungovernable. The cost of administering it exceeded any benefit it returned. The Indian independence movement had gained unstoppable momentum. In 1947, Britain withdrew. Partition followed. Millions displaced. Hundreds of thousands dead. The loss of India meant the loss of the empire's economic foundation. Other territories followed. Burma, Ceylon, Palestine. Not because Britain chose to leave, but because it could no longer afford to stay. The military was overstretched. British forces were stationed in dozens of locations across the globe. Germany, Greece, Malaya, Korea, Egypt. Each commitment required money Britain didn't have. Each withdrawal weakened the illusion of control. And yet, the government continued to speak as if Britain were still the power it had been, because admitting otherwise would have shattered the carefully maintained image. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, Britain maintained the appearance of a global power. It developed its own atomic bomb, tested in 1952. It sent troops to Korea. It held onto strategic territories, the Suez Canal Zone, Cyprus, Singapore, Aden. British diplomats still played the role of mediators and advisors. Churchill returned as Prime Minister in 1951, a symbol of wartime greatness. he spoke of Britain's enduring strength, her special relationship with America, her leadership in the Commonwealth. But behind closed doors, the situation grew more precarious. The economy stagnated. The pound weakened repeatedly. Industrial production lagged behind competitors. Britain was borrowing to maintain the lifestyle of a superpower, living on credit, on reputation, on the memory of what it had once been. The United States tolerated this because Britain remained useful, a stable ally, a naval presence in key regions, a bridge to Europe. But tolerance is not equality, and dependence is not partnership. Britain needed America far more than America needed Britain. Every military operation required American approval. Every financial crisis required American intervention. The relationship had shifted. Britain was no longer the senior partner. It was the grateful dependent. But the public narrative hadn't caught up. Neither had the political class. And then came 1956. The Suez Canal had been Britain's artery to the east since 1869. Through it passed oil from the Middle East, trade with Asia, the strategic lifeline to what remained of the empire. Egypt had been a British protectorate for decades, but in 1952, a revolution brought Gamal Abdel Nasser to power. Nasser was a nationalist, anti-colonial, determined to remove foreign influence from Egypt. In July 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal, took it from the private company controlled by British and French shareholders, declared it Egyptian property. For Britain, this was intolerable, not just economically, symbolically. Prime Minister Anthony Eden saw Nasser as a threat to British prestige, a challenge that could not go unanswered. Eden believed that if Britain did not act, the empire would be seen as weak, and perception mattered. So Britain planned a military response. In secret, it colluded with France and Israel. The plan was simple. Israel would invade Egypt. Britain and France would intervene, claiming to separate the combatants. In reality, they would seize the canal, restore control, reassert dominance. On October 29th, Israel attacked. On October 31st, British and French forces bombed Egyptian airfields. On November 5th, paratroopers landed. The operation succeeded militarily. Egyptian forces were overwhelmed. The canal was occupied. But then the world responded, and Britain discovered it had miscalculated everything. The United States was furious. President Eisenhower had not been consulted. He saw the invasion as a reckless imperial adventure, a distraction from the Cold War, an embarrassment during an election year. America condemned the invasion at the United Nations. It demanded an immediate withdrawal, and then it applied pressure, economic pressure. Britain's currency was already fragile. The pound came under attack in international markets. Reserves drained within days. Britain requested American support to stabilize the currency. America refused, unless Britain withdrew from Egypt immediately. Chancellor Harold Macmillan went to Washington to negotiate. He returned with a clear message. America would not help unless Britain left Egypt. There would be no loans, no currency support, no diplomatic cover. Britain faced a choice: continue the operation and risk financial collapse, or withdraw and admit impotence. Eden tried to hold out. He believed Britain could withstand the pressure, but the Treasury reported that reserves would be exhausted within weeks. Without American support, the pound would crash. Imports would halt. Fuel shortages would follow. The economy would seize. On November 6th, Britain announced a ceasefire. On December 22nd, the last British troops left Egypt. The operation had lasted 6 weeks. It ended in complete humiliation, not a military defeat, a political one. Britain had been forced to retreat by its closest ally. The nation that had once dictated terms to the world had been dictated to, and in that moment, the illusion shattered. The Suez Crisis revealed several truths Britain could no longer ignore. First, Britain could not act independently of the United States. Even in regions where British interests were paramount, American approval was required. Without it, Britain lacked the financial stability to sustain military operations. Second, the empire no longer generated the wealth needed to maintain itself. The cost of intervention exceeded Britain's capacity to pay. The days when colonial revenues funded imperial ambitions were over. Third, the world had moved on. The United Nations condemned the invasion. The Commonwealth was divided. India and other newly independent nations sided with Egypt. The moral authority Britain claimed as a civilizing force had evaporated. Fourth, military power alone was meaningless without economic strength. Britain had won the military battle. It lost the financial one. And in the modern world, finance determined outcomes. These were not new facts. They had been true for years. But Suez made them undeniable, even to those who had refused to see. Anthony Eden resigned in January 1957, officially for health reasons. In reality, because he had led Britain into a disaster from which it could not recover. Harold Macmillan became Prime Minister. He understood what Suez had revealed. In private meetings, he was blunt. Britain could no longer pretend to be a superpower. The Treasury could not support global commitments. The military was overstretched. The empire was finished, not immediately, but inevitably. Macmillan ordered a comprehensive review of Britain's military and strategic posture. The result was the 1957 Defence White Paper. It marked a fundamental shift. Britain would reduce its global military presence. It would rely on nuclear deterrence rather than conventional forces. It would withdraw from territories that could no longer be defended affordably. This was not presented as defeat. It was framed as modernization, strategic realignment, but everyone involved understood what it meant. Britain was scaling back, accepting limits, acknowledging that it could no longer act as it once had. The Foreign Office began planning for decolonization, not as a distant possibility, as an immediate necessity. The question was no longer whether to leave. It was how quickly territories could be transferred without creating chaos. Within 6 years, most of Britain's African colonies gained independence. Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Tanzania. Not because Britain believed they were ready, but because Britain could no longer afford to stay. No government declares its own decline. No Prime Minister stands before Parliament and says, "We are no longer powerful." The political cost would be catastrophic. The public would not accept it. Allies would distance themselves. Rivals would exploit it. So Britain did what all declining powers do. It adapted quietly, changed policy without changing rhetoric. Macmillan spoke of Britain's nuclear deterrent, of the special relationship with America, of the Commonwealth as a new form of global influence. He never said, "The empire is over." Instead, he said, "The empire is evolving." He emphasized partnership, cooperation, voluntary association. These were not lies exactly. They were reframings, ways to describe retreat without calling it retreat, ways to accept decline without admitting weakness. And it worked, because the British public wanted to believe. They wanted to think that decolonization was a choice, that Britain was granting freedom magnanimously, not that it was forced out by financial exhaustion and strategic impotence. So the narrative became one of enlightened progress. Britain was not abandoning its empire, it was transforming it into a commonwealth of equals, not losing power, redirecting it. And for a time, that story held. After Suez, British foreign policy changed fundamentally. Britain stopped trying to act as a global arbiter. It focused on Europe. In 1961, Macmillan applied for membership in the European Economic Community. This was an extraordinary shift. For decades, Britain had seen itself as separate from Europe, above Europe, connected to the world, not the continent. But Suez had clarified priorities. Britain needed economic partners, markets for its goods, a role in shaping the emerging European order. The application was vetoed by France in 1963, but the attempt itself signaled a transformation. Britain was no longer looking outward to empire. It was looking inward to Europe. Military commitments were cut. The East of Suez policy, which had defined British strategy for a century, was abandoned in 1968. British forces withdrew from the Persian Gulf, from Southeast Asia, from the Indian Ocean. Bases closed, garrisons came home. The global network of British military power dismantled, not dramatically, but steadily, one withdrawal at a time. The nuclear deterrent became Britain's primary strategic asset. The navy shrank, the army reduced, defense spending fell. Britain retained enough force to be useful to NATO, but not enough to project power independently. This was the new reality. Britain as a regional power with nuclear weapons, not a global superpower. The transition from empire to post-imperial state did not produce a crisis. There were no riots in London, no government collapse, no widespread despair. Life continued. The economy grew modestly, the welfare state expanded. People found other sources of national pride: the National Health Service, the space program, the Beatles, the 1966 World Cup. Britain redefined itself, not as an empire, but as a modern European nation, a member of the developed world, a democracy with a high standard of living. This was enough for most people. The loss of empire mattered more to politicians than to ordinary citizens. For the working class, the end of empire brought the return of resources. Fewer taxes spent on distant wars, more investment in housing, education, healthcare. The middle class adapted. They traveled as tourists, not colonists. They bought Japanese cars, German appliances, American culture. The empire had provided a sense of greatness, but it had also been expensive, dangerous, morally complicated. Most people did not mourn its passing deeply. They accepted it, moved on, found new identities, and the political class, after the initial shock, did the same. The standard narrative of the British Empire's end focuses on dramatic moments: Indian independence and partition, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the Suez Crisis. These were significant, but they were symptoms, not causes. The empire did not fall because of these events. It fell because Britain could no longer afford it, and Britain had known this long before it admitted it publicly. The real story is not the moment of collapse. It is the years of denial, the careful management of decline, the gradual acceptance of limits. History books often present decolonization as a moral choice, Britain granting freedom to oppressed peoples. This is partly true. By the 1950s, many British politicians genuinely believed colonial rule was unsustainable and unjust. But the primary driver was not morality, it was economics. Britain left because it had to, and the realization came earlier than the action. Leaders understood the empire was over before they began the process of dismantling it. They simply waited for the right moment, the right language, the right political conditions, and when they acted, they framed it as generosity, as progress, as the fulfillment of Britain's civilizing mission, not as retreat. This is how empires end, not with honesty, but with narrative. Harold Macmillan understood his role. He was not the builder of empire. He was its undertaker, but he performed the task with dignity. He gave the famous Wind of Change speech in South Africa in 1960. It acknowledged that African nationalism was inevitable. that colonial rule could not continue, that Britain must adapt. This was the first time a British Prime Minister publicly accepted the end of empire. But even then, he framed it positively, as evolution, not defeat, as recognition of historical forces, not admission of weakness. And it worked. The speech became a defining moment, not because it was radical, but because it gave permission. Permission for Britain to let go, to stop fighting the inevitable, to accept that the world had changed. Other leaders followed his lead. Ian MacLeod, the colonial secretary, accelerated independence for African territories. He negotiated transitions, established timetables, transferred power, not because he wanted to, but because he knew it was necessary, and because delay would only make the process more violent and chaotic. By 1965, most of the empire was gone. By 1970, Britain was a mid-sized European power. By 1980, the empire was a memory, and through it all, the government maintained the illusion of control, the idea that this was Britain's choice, that decolonization was the result of British values, not British exhaustion. Even after the empire ended, Britain held onto symbols: the Commonwealth, the monarchy, the permanent seat on the UN Security Council, the nuclear arsenal. These were remnants, tokens of past greatness. But they served a purpose. They allowed Britain to imagine itself as still relevant, still influential, still a player on the world stage. And to some degree, this was true. Britain remained wealthier than most nations. Its culture had global reach. Its language became the world's lingua franca, but these were legacies, not active powers. Britain no longer shaped the world, it responded to it, and the difference was profound. The empire had been about control, about dictating terms, about imposing will. The post-imperial era was about adaptation, about finding a place in a world dominated by superpowers, about accepting that influence was not the same as power. This was the hardest lesson. Not that the empire was over, but that it would never return. That the world which had allowed Britain to dominate no longer existed, and that nostalgia could not resurrect it. History often imagines that great powers fall with drama, invasions, revolutions, cataclysms, but most empires do not end this way. They end with recognition, a quiet understanding that the future will be different. Britain's empire ended the day it understood it could not continue as it had. That day was not dramatic. It was not even singular. It came gradually through many small realizations. But if one moment forced the recognition into the open, it was Suez, the day Britain was told to withdraw by its own ally. The day the illusion of independence collapsed. The day it became clear that Britain's power existed only as long as America permitted it. After that, everything else was inevitability. Decolonization, military withdrawal, economic reorientation, strategic acceptance. These were not choices made freely, they were accommodations to reality. And they happened quietly, without announcement, without ceremony, because that is how empires end, not with an explosion, but with a realization, a moment when those in power understand, and then adapt, and then move on, leaving the public to believe the story they are told, that it was always the plan, that it was always inevitable, that Britain chose this path, when in truth, the path chose Britain. And the empire simply stopped resisting. Decades later, the British Empire exists only in memory, in museums, in architecture, in the English language spoken across continents, in the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of former colonies, in the complex legacies of borders drawn arbitrarily, of systems imposed without consent, of wealth extracted and never returned. The empire shaped the modern world, but it does not control it. Britain is now a nation among nations, important but not exceptional, influential but not dominant, and most people accept this, because the alternative, clinging to a past that cannot return, leads only to bitterness. The lesson of empire is not that power is eternal, it is that power is temporary, and those who understand this adapt. Those who resist it suffer. Britain adapted, not quickly, not willingly, but eventually. And in doing so, it avoided the fate of empires that fought their decline until the end. It retained stability, democracy, prosperity, not greatness perhaps, but something more sustainable. A nation that had learned to live without empire, without the illusion of dominance, without the burden of ruling others. And in that, there was a kind of peace. History often ends not with a moment, but with an acceptance. The British Empire did not fall on a single day. It faded over decades. But there was a day when those in power understood that it had already ended, that the future would not include it, that adaptation was not optional. That day came quietly, without declaration, without drama, just a realization, and then the long process of letting go. This is how most great stories conclude, not with spectacle, but with recognition, the understanding that the world has changed, and that resisting change only delays the inevitable. Britain's empire ended the moment Britain stopped believing in its permanence. Everything after that was simply administration, the sorting of details, the transfer of responsibilities, the quiet retreat from a century of dominance. And when it was over, the world moved on, as it always does, because empires rise and empires fall. And the only constant is that those who see the truth early suffer less than those who see it late. Britain saw it, accepted it, and survived, not as it was, but as it needed to become. And history, which remembers the drama, often forgets the quiet wisdom of knowing when to stop. If you value thoughtful history told without noise, like this video and subscribe to Echoes of Greatness.